Hi, I'm Kim Cooper, and welcome to my Emotional Intelligence Masterclass. Today, we're going to be talking about emotional avoidance, which I think is highly relevant because today is April 3rd, 2020, and in Australia, as in most of the world, we're in lockdown because of the COVID-19 virus pandemic. So, anyway, I won't tell you up front why I think it's relevant, but I think you might discover that as we get into this lecture on emotional avoidance. The lectures I'll be presenting in his class are free on YouTube, and you can access the associated articles and exercises or join our group discussions if you visit the link that's below this movie in YouTube. Okay, so before I jump ahead into our inner connections work, which I promised in my last movie, which I'm really excited about sharing, it's Unit 4 in the masterclass work, but I know that a lot of you have already worked through the first 3 units, and I've spent a lot of time reworking the inner connections work, and I'm really looking forward to presenting that soon. Even if you haven't worked through unit 2 and 3, or you're still working on unit 1 at the moment, the inner connections work is really going to be highly valuable, especially because I think a lot of us have got a lot of time at the moment, and we're making decisions that have to be based on a lot of uncertainty. And so it's a really good time for us to be talking about uncertainty, which is what we'll be talking about in this lecture, and also discovering a way, which is what I will talk about in the inner connections work, of accessing our own inner wisdom in a way that's really reliable. Okay, so emotional avoidance. This topic follows on from my last lecture where we talked about emotional rackets and why we run them. So, getting straight into it. In short, emotional avoidance is about us avoiding negative emotions that may be asking something of us that we really are not ready to face. Honest feedback from others may make us defensive. The hangover doesn't cause us to reconsider our drinking. Giving our friends honest feedback on their problems is too uncomfortable for us to deal with. And so instead we agree with their assessment that they're an innocent victim, when really we know that they're actually causing a lot of their own problems. But we just feel too uncomfortable to be able to say that to them honestly. Emotional avoidance is really anything that we do to avoid looking at what our genuine emotions are telling us. As humans, we're really, really good at this. And there's a long list of terms that psychology uses to describe some of the ways that we do it. There's a lot of terms: motivated reasoning, wishful thinking, cognitive dissonance, confirmation bias, projection, rationalization, repression, denial, distortion, reaction formation, splitting, groupthink, idealization, intellectualization, displacement, sublimation, minimization, and then, of course, just outright egomania. So, okay, the fact that we're so good at avoiding our negative emotions brings up a subject that I know may be challenging for some of my audience, but I do think that we really do need to give some attention to. With our inclination to avoid data that might cause us negative feelings, really, is positive thinking something that we should be encouraging? I've watched several people in my life that have nearly been destroyed by parenting which fed their children's egos, without giving their children really any ability to get an accurate bead on their true worth or performance. I say that, and I was one of those children. The way my mother talked about us as children, you really would have thought that we were celebrities or gods or something. It was well-meaning, and I love my mother, but it was also highly destructive as well. Because as children, really, we're just such vulnerable humans, and we might think that the world centers around us, but really we're relying on honest feedback and direction from the adults around us. We don't benefit from being told how amazing we are 24/7. Overplaying a child's talents and uniqueness will create mental illness a lot faster than it will build self-esteem. I mean, if I'm so amazing and incredibly special, how come everybody else in the room can't see that? Why don't other people praise me in the same way that my mother did? How do I assess my actual value as a human? Instead of possessing healthy self-esteem, people who've grown up with this kind of wishful thinking, brainwashing, tend to face a self-worth roller coaster through their lives that many barely survive. Sometimes they feel superior and sometimes they feel inferior, but really never feel like that they fit in. As a victim of this myself, I say that the positive thinking movement really urgently needs rethinking. I mean, how could we have got to a place where we encourage a kind of thinking that doesn't allow us to assess ourselves and our lives accurately? Gaining a solid understanding of how positive thinking can be detrimental takes us back to what we learned in my last talk about emotional rackets being static. Now, since we're talking about ways that we fool ourselves, and what I want to explain here can be a little bit complicated to grasp, I think it's good if we walk through an example. Let's say you're a person who is scared of facing uncertainty and how vulnerable we are as humans. Because everything was managed for you when you were growing up, and your parents isolated you from things that might have caused you to have to face uncomfortable emotions, you really haven't been equipped to deal with life's difficulties. If a pet died in your family, maybe your parents just tried to hide that from you and replaced it. They may have also tried to manage a lot of things for you whenever situations became difficult. Or maybe you grew up in a different situation where you had so much chaos and trauma around you that you ended up becoming someone who just really rigidly tries to control your environment now to feel safe. Or then maybe your fear of uncertainty just comes from living in our society where we avoid talking about death or anything too unpleasant. So one way or another, in this example, you've come to be a person who is really uncomfortable about facing death and facing uncertainty. And so instead, you just avoid it. But then life is uncertain and people die. So how can avoiding this kind of uncertainty even be possible? Well, don't worry. As humans, we're great at avoidance. And so one thing that you might do is set up an emotional racket based on guilt. Now, how this works is someone close to you dies, and instead of facing the uncertainty that that situation will bring up in you and the vulnerability that it'll bring up in you, you blame yourself instead. And by blaming yourself, you can then pretend that you still had some kind of control over it. Because no matter how unpleasant guilt is, At least it allows you to still see yourself on center stage with your hands still kind of on all the levers. Because guilt places us in the starring role, we often choose it over facing vulnerability. But then, like the little boy with his finger in the dike, we're stuck holding back the torrent. Because if our guilt's the only thing that stops us facing that, no matter how careful we are, we might still make a fatal mistake one day, or due to circumstances entirely beyond our control, a loved one might be taken from us again. We're stuck with it. As long as we want to avoid facing the universal truth of our genuine vulnerability to death, we'll need to keep running the guilt racket. And if not guilt, well, maybe blame. And then to deal with the discomfort and boredom that our guilt and blames racket cause us, along comes the positive thinking crowd. They're going to pump up our ego and tell us not to worry. It wasn't your fault. You did all you could. Don't feel guilty or blame someone else. Just don't worry and be happy. And so now we spend our days repeating positive mantras. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Thank you. I love you. Or everything's okay. Blah, blah will save us. Uncertainty is all the evil king's fault. But because none of this faces the genuine emotion that we are fearing and learn from it, just like all of our other addictions that we use to assuage our guilt, these mantras and beliefs only work superficially. And by the time we're old, the problem gets even worse because the truth is even harder to avoid looking at. People die, and we're going to die, and really there's nothing we can do about it. But still, older people find this hard to talk about because now magical thinking has taken over. Don't talk about death or you might die. You can talk about your feelings of guilt or you can blame other people all you like, but whatever you do, don't talk about death. Now, through all of this, we miss what our fear could have taught us if we'd only found the courage to face our true feelings. That life is tenacious and purposeful, but it's also fragile and uncertain, and so we really should take care to value all that it offers. The need to face our mortality is universal, and reflecting on the fact that we will die one day is highly positive at motivating positive change in ourselves. Or maybe we might run a guilt racket in situations where we could have done better, but instead of finding the courage to assess our poor performance, we wear guilt like a cloak and just call ourselves a lousy person all around. Isn't it funny that instead of learning from our mistakes, many of us would rather condemn ourselves to this kind of judgment? The truth is that if we don't train ourselves to face our fears at some point with honesty, most of our lives are going to end up being pretty illogical like this. When so many people accuse emotion of being the antagonist of reason, I find this really highly ironic. The truth might be something closer to that emotional rackets and not emotion itself are really the antagonists of reason. Okay, but back to emotional avoidance and positive thinking. Like taking a painkiller instead of getting an X-ray, positive thinking seeks to relieve us of the fixed emotions that our emotional rackets cause us, such as persistent feelings of guilt and blame, without recognizing what the genuine emotion is that we're avoiding and what it's signaling us to face beneath the racket. In doing this, positive thinking becomes just another form of avoidance or salve, if you like like all of the other addictions that allow the real lessons in our life to go unlearned. The answer is just merely common sense. Face your fears and stop avoiding them. All of us are unique, and most of us are special to someone, and dying is a natural part of life. Okay, so what I've said about positive thinking might sound like I'm criticizing the Hawaiian practice of Ho'oponopono, which I've been told teaches the mantra that I used a minute ago. I'm sorry, please forgive me, thank you, I love you. I'm no expert in this, but I did find when I looked into it that in Hawaii, where it comes from, Ho'oponopono is used more as a conflict resolution practice than it is a mantra to avoid facing negative feelings. One quote I found described what sounds to me much more like the authentic practice. The quote reads, "A statement of the problem is made and the transgression discussed. Family members are expected to work problems through and cooperate, not hold fast to who's at fault. One or more periods of silence may be taken for reflection on the entanglement of emotions and injuries. Everyone's feelings are acknowledged. Then confession, repentance, and forgiveness take place. Everyone releases each other, letting go. Reflection, discussion, acknowledgement of guilt and other negative emotions. How different is this kind of process than what is offered in most positive affirmation mantras?" This talk is about avoidance and not about death, but as death will affect all of us one day and is one of the most common things that we avoid facing, I'd like to add a few more words on it. How many people die without a will? How many die not leaving their family the means to bury them? How many have their affairs in order in a way that acknowledges that one day someone is going to have to clean up after them? If you were at the point of death looking back over your life, suddenly seeing it as a story with an ending, are there things that you might do differently? And if we find the courage to face our death, what else is there left to fear? For a moment, let's think about how different our lives might be if we were to take time out every day to acknowledge that one day we will most certainly die. Are there emotions you run as a racket? Your world won't fall apart if you take your finger off the dike by facing your genuine fears that lie beneath that racket. Facing our positive fears won't make things positive for us all of the time, but still, they'll help us move out of guilt and depression and some of the other negative mindsets that hold us trapped in negative patterns, and allow us to move into a more natural state where our emotions flow a little bit more like the weather. Okay, so next we're going to be discussing our means of connecting with our own inner wisdom in my Inner Connections work, which I'm really looking forward to presenting, and I hope that you'll come and join us in our online classrooms.